All right, so let's dive in. We're looking at some material you sent over, and it features a perspective from King's College London. Well, it's definitely something. Quite challenging.
Yeah, it is. It's a discussion with Professor David Betz.
Exactly. And he lays out this really compelling, but maybe pretty unsettling view about potential future conflict right here in Western societies.
It's a stark outlook.
It really is. So our goal today, basically, is to unpack his analysis from that source you shared. We want to get into his core arguments, look at the evidence he's pointing to, the scholarship, and really try to get a handle on the implications of what he's saying. It's a tough topic, no doubt. But the mission is just to get you informed about his specific perspective, as laid out in the material you gave us.
Right. And I'm here to help kind of synthesize Professor Betz's points, connect some dots within his argument, and maybe clarify why he thinks this view is backed up by, the research and trends he talks about in the sources. We'll navigate it together.
Okay, sounds good. Let's jump straight to the bit that probably made everyone sit up straight. Professor Betz saying civil war is, yes, probably coming to the West. And he even puts a time frame on it, potentially within 5 years. With a very significant probability. That's a huge claim. How does he even get to that kind of number? What's the method he mentions?
Okay, so that figure, it actually comes from the work of another scholar he relies on quite heavily, Barbara Walter.
Oh, okay.
Particularly her book, How Civil Wars Start. And her research suggests that in any given year, if the conditions are right, the sort of underlying conditions for civil war.
If they're present.
Exactly. If they're present, there's about a 4% statistical chance of one breaking out.
Right. 4% per year.
Per year. So Professor Betz takes that 4% annual chance, and using the UK just as an example here, he extrapolates it over 5 years. And if you do the compound math, that 4% chance each year for 5 years adds up to roughly 18.5% probability. And he clearly finds Walter's scholarship credible. He accepts that 4% annual likelihood, if those conditions exist, as a valid starting point for his thinking.
Right. But the key there is, if the conditions exist.
That's the absolute core of it. His entire prediction hinges on his firm belief that the conditions Barbara Walter identifies as leading to civil war. Well, he believes they currently exist in the West.
Right now.
Right now. And he thinks they're likely to stick around, or maybe even get worse over the next 5 years. That's precisely why he picks that 5-year window. He feels those conditions make a prediction within that time frame, somewhat credible. Further out than that, too speculative for him.
Okay, so an 18%, nearly 1 in 5 chance in a single country over 5 years.
Yeah.
That already sounds quite high. But you mentioned the source suggests is actually worse than that. Why? How does the fact that the world, especially Western Europe, is so interconnected crank up that risk even more, according to him?
Right, because he makes this really crucial point that civil wars often aren't just isolated events within one country's borders. They're significantly more likely to happen if a neighboring country is already going through one. Conflict can be, contagious.
Like it spills over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he argues these underlying conditions, they aren't just in one place. He sees them as prevalent more or less throughout the Western world and very heavily throughout Western Europe.
So widespread conditions.
Yeah. So picture Western Europe deeply interconnected, right? Trade, travel, information. If conflict were to ignite somewhere, and the source mentions examples he sees as potential flashpoints, like Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Sweden, he argues it's quite likely to spread or spill over into others. He even throws out an arbitrary number in the source, like maybe a 50% chance of it spreading to a neighbor, just to illustrate the point.
Just as an example.
Yeah, just to show how when the conditions are everywhere and the region's connected, the overall probability across the whole area gets multiplied significantly. It goes way beyond that 18% for just one country. The borders don't really hold the risk back in that scenario.
That interconnectedness.
Yeah.
That paints a much broader, more worrying picture.
Oh.
So let's move to the drivers.
Yeah.
What does he see as causing this? He talks about 2 vectors leading towards potential conflict. And he's very clear it's not just about Islamism, right?
Exactly. He states that very explicitly. Islamism is part of it, one half of the equation, he calls it, but it's not the whole story.
Okay, so what are the 2 vectors?
So the first one he describes as interethnic conflict, and this is where he directly links it to Islamism, saying it's a tension society's been dealing with for like 25 years now. Deeply connected to the whole subtext of the war on terror. He points out how it's visibly changed cities over that time.
Okay, that's vector one. What's the second?
The second vector is what he calls a peasant revolt. Now, he stresses he doesn't mean that term in a negative way, not disparagingly.
Right.
This vector, he argues, comes from this really deep feeling among the majority population that the elite is fundamentally changing the rules of the game, changing society in ways that harm their interests, their well-being. And this provokes a really strong reaction.
And a backlash.
Kind of. He talks about these postnational elites, as the source puts it.
Yeah.
Leaders who are seen, from this perspective anyway, as having sort of betrayed their own countries.
How so?
Well, they're seen as skeptical, maybe even suspicious, of nationalism itself, not really thinking in terms of the national interest anymore.
Got it. So interethnic conflict and this peasant revolt against elites, how do they connect?
And that's a critical insight, according to Betz, how these two vectors interact. He sees them colliding.
Right.
And this collision leads to what he calls Ulsterization. That's the interethnic tension, like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And balkanization. That's the fragmentation driven by the revolt against the perceived elites. He says these two things are happening at the same time, and they actually drive each other. They feed into each other.
Wow. Okay, so not just one thing, but two powerful forces potentially making each other worse. That peasant revolt idea, that feeling of a disconnect with the elite. Can you give us some specific examples from the source that Professor Betz uses to show what he means? What does that disconnect look like?
Yeah, absolutely. The source gives a few anecdotes he points to. One really striking one is about the UK's anti-terrorist program, Prevent.
Okay.
He mentions reports suggesting that people who, express concern that Western culture might be at risk from other cultures, they could potentially be flagged, put on a watch list.
Seriously.
That's the suggestion he references. And he sees this as either, the government just completely failing to understand mainstream public views, or maybe worse, a deliberate attempt to actually suppress those views.
Okay, what else?
He also talks about what he sees as hypocrisy from elites, like when they call for a unified collective we, or national unity.
Right.
Like the example given in the source about displaying Ukraine flags. He argues that feels kind of hollow, maybe even ludicrous, coming from the very people who, in his analysis, have spent the last generation actively, quote, destroying any sensible notion of a collective we.
How is destroying it?
By, undermining or eroding the very idea of a shared national identity. So when they need to call on it, it's just not there anymore, or it feels fake.
I see. Any other examples?
Yeah, the source mentions a couple more specific things cited as illustrations of this post-national elite attitude. There's a story about a UK Labour politician apparently criticizing someone in their constituency for flying an England flag on St. George's Day.
Oof.
And also Justin Trudeau's earlier declaration that Canada is the first post-national country. These are presented as moments that really fuel that perception of a deep disconnect between elites and traditional national feelings.
Those examples definitely highlight the tension he's describing. So how does he see this potential conflict actually starting? Is it like a switch flips, or does he see signs already?
He definitely thinks the first echoes or the first moments are already happening. He uses that phrase, protoform?
Protoform.
Yeah, like the early stages. It's not full-blown conflict, but he sees evidence of it beginning.
What kind of evidence?
He points to a few things mentioned in the source.
Okay.
The reaction to events in Southport. He reads that as the government being very aware, maybe even frightened, of these underlying interethnic tensions just bubbling up. He also mentions focus groups, saying that ordinary middle-class people are apparently talking about civil war and civil conflict much more regularly now than you'd expect.
Wow.
Then there's the Blade Runners, the people targeting the ULEZ cameras in London.
Right, I heard about that.
He highlights the scale the source mentions, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 cameras damaged, and contrasts that with the state response citing only one arrest at the time the source was recorded. He interprets that gap as potentially showing low state ability to protect its own infrastructure, combined with maybe quite high public tolerance or even support for those kinds of disruptive actions.
Interesting interpretation. Anything else?
Yeah, attacks on infrastructure more broadly. Things like cyber attacks reported against the Paris Olympics infrastructure, the fire at the Heathrow electrical substation, whether it was accidental or deliberate. It showed the vulnerability, right? And the potential economic damage.
Definitely.
And also reports of deliberate attacks on the French electrical grid down south.
So attacking the system itself.
Exactly. He uses a specific term for these tactics, system disruption. The whole idea isn't necessarily mass casualties. It's about disrupting the system power, transport, communications to cause chaos and achieve a political effect, to make the system kludge up, as he puts it.
Kludge up. Okay.
And he points out the strategic pluses of this, according to the source. You don't need huge numbers of people to potentially cause really big effects.
Right.
And maybe crucially, he quotes Professor Betz saying it's much easier to get people to break things than it is to get them to break people.
The psychological barrier.
Exactly. It's maybe a lower hurdle for ordinary people to cross to engage in damaging property for a political cause compared to actually committing violence against other individuals.
That makes a kind of grim sense. Disrupting infrastructure feels less direct, maybe? Less personal?
Perhaps.
But how does he see this protoform, damaging cameras hitting a substation? How does that scale up to actual civil war? That still feels like a massive leap.
Yeah, it does. He describes a scenario where this system disruption doesn't stay as just isolated incidents. It scales up a lot.
How much?
To the point where it affects entire cities, or at least significant parts of major cities.
Yeah.
He uses London as an example again. And crucially, it becomes regular. It happens often.
Like?
Imagine, he suggests, the power going out or the gas supply failing across large parts of London every 2 weeks, maybe throughout the winter.
Okay, that would be hugely disruptive.
Massively. And he compares the potential scale of the reaction to something like the 2011 London riots. He cites the numbers from back then, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 rioters out on a given night, with perhaps 200 or 300 being seriously violent.
I remember the police were stretched thin then.
Totally overwhelmed. So Betz's scenario is that in this future situation, triggered by constant widespread system disruption, the numbers could be way bigger, maybe 20,000 or 30,000 rioters, with perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 actively violent ones.
Wow.
And the core idea is that the system disruption itself, about the lights going out, the heat off, communications down, the feeling of order breaking down, effectively switches off the supports that normally keep large urban populations functioning, and frankly, keep them from losing it, as he puts it.
Okay, that paints a pretty bleak picture of escalation. Now, when we think civil war, often the image is, two clear sides, two armies. But Professor Betz suggests it wouldn't be like that.
No, he's very clear on that. It won't be a simple two sides thing at all. He expects it to be way more complicated than that.
Complicated how?
Potentially involving multiple factions, multiple groups. That's where his term balkanization comes in. Again, that sense of fragmentation into many competing sides.
So messy.
Very messy. He even points out there's a grave semantic difficulty just trying to define the sides, especially when you try to talk about the native population without it becoming instantly loaded or problematic.
Yeah, that's tricky language. So how does he frame it?
Well, initially he sort of leans towards framing it maybe as a cultural issue, a broad conflict between people who identify strongly with traditional Western values versus others.
Okay.
But he's pretty pessimistic about how long that framing would last. He believes that once real violence kicks off, it will metastasize fairly rapidly.
Metastasize.
Yeah, like a cancer spreading. It will move beyond just cultural lines and become straight interethnic conflict. And he doesn't shy away from grim examples used in the source, drawn from other civil wars, things like drilling out kneecaps or throwing religious leaders off bridges. Horrific stuff, highlighting how brutal it gets when the cultural pretenses fall away.
Oh, that's awful.
He compares it to the breakdown of Yugoslavia in the early to mid-90s. He emphasizes how fast that went from people thinking, oh, it couldn't happen here, to just bedlam, absolute chaos. And under that kind of extreme stress, fear, with no state protection you can rely on, people just rapidly fall back on the most basic identity markers to find safety. They look for your tribe.
So a complex, fragmented conflict that quickly gets brutal and tribal. How does he describe the actual process? Like, how does society get from here to there, according to the source?
He talks about a process he calls assortative movement.
Assortative movement.
Yeah, this happens after the violence has really started, when, as he puts it pretty bluntly in the source, the shits hit the fan. At that point, people who hadn't already left the big cities, and he notes that's a trend already happening, citing things like the Casey report on community segregation in the UK.
Right, people moving out.
Exactly. Those who hadn't left yet now start to flee much more overtly, urgently.
And assortative means?
It means they aren't just moving randomly. They are actively looking around, asking themselves, okay, where am I actually going to be safe now? Who are my people? Who is my tribe? Where can I go to be with them?
Right. Seeking safety in numbers, with people like them.
Precisely. And they move to places where they think their tribe or community is strong or where they perceive they'll be safer.
And this involves loss, presumably.
Huge loss. He points out people aren't generally selling their homes nicely in this scenario. They're abandoning them, fleeing.
Yeah.
And critically, these people who are fleeing, they've likely experienced violence directly or seen it or been victimized. This experience, he argues, increases their sense of grievance and reduces the entry costs to further violence.
Meaning they're more likely to become violent themselves.
Yeah, or at least support it. It's like that tipping point metaphor he uses. Once things start rolling downhill, they just gather speed, get faster and more violent. It feeds itself.
Giving this a really grim outlook.
Yeah.
What about getting out? If things really do kick off, does Professor Betz think there's anywhere safe to go?
Yeah.
Is escape an option?
His answer on that is pretty starkly pessimistic. He says, quite plainly, there isn't really an obvious place to go.
Nowhere.
Not easily, no. He uses this historical comparison. Think about conflicts centuries ago, like the English Civil War. People could, theoretically, get on a ship like the Mayflower and go somewhere else entirely.
Right, find new land.
Exactly. He contrasts that with today's world, which is much more full, as he puts it. There's no terra nullius, no vast, empty, unclaimed lands to escape to. And this ties back to his point about interconnectedness, especially in Europe. He strongly implies that once conflict really starts in one Western European country, it's quite likely to spread. Those borderless connections make it really hard to contain.
So finding a truly safe haven within the region would be very difficult.
That seems to be his assessment, yeah. Very difficult.
Okay. So not many places to run to.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to prevention. Is there anything governments or societies can do now to stop this scenario, according to him? The source mentions immigration is a big public concern. Would tackling that be enough?
His view on prevention is blunt. He says, essentially, there isn't anything they can do. This is baked in.
Baked in. Wow. So no hope for prevention.
He seems to think society is already past the political off-ramp, meaning normal politics, policy changes. They can't solve the underlying problems anymore.
Why not?
He argues that almost every plausible way forward involves some kind of violence. Like any attempt by the government to fix one problem will probably just make another problem worse. It's a kind of policy catch-22.
That's crap.
Yeah. So based on the source, he clearly believes we're past the tipping point for preventing it. The focus has to shift, in his view, to mitigating the costs once conflict actually starts.
Okay, if we can't prevent it, how do we mitigate it? What does he suggest?
He outlines a few areas for mitigation that are mentioned in the source.
Okay.
1, limit the duration of the conflict. Shorter is always better. Less damage, fewer deaths.
Makes sense.
2, give serious thought now to cultural protection. How do we safeguard important cultural sites, artifacts, museums, protect them from potential iconoclasm, vandalism, theft during chaos? He feels this is especially vital for somewhere like the UK with so much history.
Right, protect the heritage.
3, prioritize planning for safe areas, places where maybe some level of normal civil life could continue. The idea is partly to reduce the brain drain, stop all the skilled people with money and options from just fleeing the country entirely.
Try to keep some normalcy, some expertise.
Exactly. And 4, for states that have them, plan meticulously for securing nuclear assets. He points out this was managed successfully after the Soviet Union collapsed, but stresses it needs prior planning to make sure those weapons aren't threatened or fall into the wrong hands during
Securing the nukes, yeah. That's essential.
critical.
That shift from prevention to mitigation really underlines how serious he views this. Let's talk about the human cost. It's the hardest part. What does Professor Betz actually envision?
He's very direct about it. He says he envisions many deaths and adds that he wouldn't be speaking out like this if he didn't believe that was a serious possibility.
Many deaths. Does he give any scale?
He offers a potential range while admitting it's incredibly hard to predict accurately.
Okay.
At the lower end, he suggests scaling up the single worst year of the Northern Ireland Troubles to the whole UK population. That comes out to around 23,000 deaths. He calls that the bottom of the range.
23,000. That's still horrific.
Absolutely. And then at the higher end, he looks at conflicts like Bosnia or Syria, where deaths reached maybe 1% to 4% of the population. Scaled to the UK, that could mean up to 500,000 deaths. 500,000.
500,000.
Now, he doesn't think it's likely to reach that serious scale, but he sees a number somewhere between 23,000 and 500,000 as plausible. And he describes both ends of that range as, quote, horrendous.
Yeah. Horrendous is the word.
And beyond deaths, he also talks about massive economic and social damage and people being uprooted in very large numbers, displacement, refugees.
Just devastating. In the source, someone asks him about personal choices, like moving out of a big city like London. What's his advice?
His advice, based purely on his analysis, is relayed as, I would probably avoid the big cities.
Avoid the big cities.
Yeah. He suggests that if you have the choice, reducing your exposure to major urban centers might be a prudent step.
And the source also mentions his own personal stance.
Right. It adds that striking personal note that he sees himself as a quintessential Western man, feels deeply connected to Britain despite being an immigrant himself, says he's not going anywhere, and wouldn't want to just stand by passively if things went wrong.
That adds another layer to it.
It does. It shows he's not just detachedly analyzing this.
Now, Professor Betz must know this analysis is controversial, that it will face criticism. How does he feel his case holds up against other views?
His response on that is pretty confident. He basically says that the facts speak in favor of the case he's making.
So he thinks the evidence supports him.
Yeah. He argues his view isn't some fringe idea, but actually entirely in line with general understandings of how societies function or dysfunction.
How so?
He points to established research on things necessary for stable democracy, for healthy economies, and he connects his argument to widely documented trends in social science, things like the collapse of trust in institutions across the West, growing alienation between people and their governments, problems linked to financialization. He sees these as accepted realities that underpin his argument.
So he's drawing on existing research.
Definitely. He explicitly details his reliance on other prominent scholars mentioned in the source to back up his points. People like Sheldon Wolin, who wrote about managed democracy. Paul Collier, whose book Exodus looked at mass migration's impact. Collier noted it can reduce community cohesion and social capital if uncontrolled, warning against both panic and uncontrolled flows.
Okay.
And Robert Putnam, who he calls the grandfather of modern sociology. Putnam's research famously documented how diversity can initially decrease social capital before maybe new forms emerge later. So Betz stresses his analysis isn't just him. It's built on decades of work by scholars arguably more eminent than himself.
He's standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
That's the picture he paints, and he wraps up this point with a really impactful line from the source aimed at the leadership class. Dear elites, the consequences of your actions have arrived.
Wow.
He frames his whole message not as some wild prediction, but as simply reflecting the observable results of past actions and established research on how societies hold together or fall apart.
The consequences of your actions have arrived.
That's powerful. Okay, just briefly, the source touches on a really long-term outlook. This idea that the West could, maybe, become something like an Islamic state in 100 years, based on demographics. How does Betz respond to that?
Right. He acknowledges that if you just look at pure demographic projections, like the one mentioned suggesting Britain could be minority white by 2063, maybe sooner for younger age groups, then yes, you could theoretically project such a scenario if...
If what?
If you assume people are just totally passive, inert.
Yeah.
That demographic flows just continue unchanged and people don't react. But he doesn't think society is completely inert.
He thinks people will react.
Yeah. And he brings in this really interesting reference to George Orwell's 1940 essay about England. Orwell looked back 100 years, from 1840 to 1940, and saw a clear continuity, a continuous civilization and cultural identity.
So Betz poses this really provocative question. Can we say the same about England, or the West more broadly, looking from 1940 to 2040? He says he suspects that somewhere between 1940 and 2040 occurs a break that terminates what England was, a fundamental cultural shift or rupture.
A break in that continuity.
Exactly. And this leads to what he calls his gut feeling, and he's careful to distinguish this from his academic analysis.
Okay, his gut feeling is.
His gut feeling is that people will react against this potential loss or displacement of their core cultural identity. He senses that people feel an urgency, maybe based on some deep, almost unfamiliar instinct. He describes it as a button in the solar plexus being pushed.
A deep, visceral reaction.
Yeah, and he sees how people react to that fundamental feeling as the crucial question for the future. He hopes it doesn't take us completely off the scale, but he feels we're currently at a very perilous moment regarding this potential cultural break and the reactions it might provoke.
A perilous moment that certainly seems to capture the weight of his perspective. For listeners who want to read more of Professor Betz's work themselves, where does the source say they can find it?
The source mentions two main things. There are articles titled Civil War Comes to the West, published in Military Strategy magazine. Those should be searchable online.
Okay.
And he also apparently has a book coming out, likely in the spring, that will go into these ideas in much more detail.
Good to know. Wow. Okay, that has been a really deep dive into a frankly stark and complex and, challenging perspective from Professor Betz based on the material you shared with us. We've covered his prediction that probability calculation rooted in Barbara Walters' work and his assessment of current conditions. We dug into those two interacting vectors, the interethnic conflict and the peasant revolt against elites. We looked at the proto-forms he sees now, like system disruption, and how that can scale up.
Yeah, the potential for escalation.
Right. The complexity of the sides, the grim outlook for escape. His view that prevention is basically off the table, shifting focus to mitigation.
And the potential human cost.
And that devastating potential human cost. Plus, his personal take, the scholarly basis he argues for, and those longer-term thoughts on cultural identity.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did, and it's really important. We reiterate, like always, this has been about unpacking one specific expert perspective presented in the source material you provided. We've tried to lay out Professor Betz's analysis, his sources, his conclusions as presented there, not to endorse them, but just to help you understand the argument he's making.
Absolutely. And maybe just a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Building on that idea Betz raises about deep instincts and identity. If he's right that there's some fundamental button in the solar plexus related to identity in place, one that's maybe been suppressed but could trigger a powerful reaction, how aware are you of those kinds of deep instincts in yourself or in society around you? And what might their reemergence actually mean for the path ahead? It connects back to that Orwell point, that potential cultural break.
That's a really profound question to sit with. Where do those deep feelings lead? Thank you for sending us the source material for this deep dive. We hope this conversation helped you get your head around the arguments and potential implications presented in it. And we definitely invite you to continue your own thinking and exploration of these really complex and undoubtedly challenging ideas.